October 12th, 1941, 6:47 a.m., St. Adalbert's Church, Krakow, Poland. Father Karol Kozłowski, 34 years old, stood at the altar preparing for morning mass when the heavy wooden doors of his church exploded open. 6 Gestapo officers in black leather coats marched down the center aisle, their jackboots echoing against the stone floor like gunshots. The lead officer, SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Müller, carried a folder thick with documents. The air inside the church, usually filled with the scent of incense and old wood, now reeked of fear and the sharp cologne that German officers seemed to bathe in. Father Kozłowski didn't move from the altar. He had been expecting this visit for weeks. Ever since he had begun reading the names of executed Polish intellectuals during his sermons, ever since he had started hiding Jewish families in the church basement, ever since he had refused to remove the Polish flag from above the crucifix. The mathematics of resistance were brutal and simple. Speak truth to power, and power will eventually come for you. The occupation of Poland had been systematic and merciless. By October 1941, the Nazis had been implementing their plan to destroy Polish culture, religion, and identity for over 2 years. Under Operation Tannenberg and later AB Action, they had executed over 100 Zaozoziran Polish intellectuals, priests, teachers, and leaders. Churches were being closed, converted into warehouses, or destroyed entirely. The Catholic Church in Poland, with its 11 Zaozoziran parishes and deep cultural roots, represented everything the Nazis sought to eliminate. It was the backbone of Polish identity, the keeper of Polish memory, the voice of Polish conscience. Heinrich Himmler had been explicit in his instructions. The Polish priest is our enemy. Of the 10 Zaozoziran Polish priests serving when the war began, more than 800 would be murdered in concentration camps. Father Kozłowski knew these statistics. He had counted the empty chairs in diocesan meetings, had read the names of the dead in letters from bishops across occupied Poland. He also knew something else. His parishioners were watching. Every Sunday, 800 people filled the pews of St. Adalbert's. They came not just for spiritual comfort, but for something much more dangerous. They came to hear someone speak truth in a world built on lies. SS Oberfuhrer Müller stopped 3 feet from the altar and opened his folder. His Polish was accented but precise, the product of careful preparation. Father Kozłowski, you have been conducting illegal activities in this church. You have been spreading anti-German propaganda during religious services. You have been harboring enemies of the Reich. These activities end today. He pulled out a typed document and began reading charges. Incitement to rebellion, harboring Jewish fugitives, distributing banned literature, conducting unauthorized religious instruction, displaying prohibited Polish symbols. Each charge carried a potential death sentence. Father Kozłowski listened to the accusations while studying Müller's face. The German officer was younger than expected, perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of pale blue eyes that seemed almost colorless in the dim church lighting. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to razor sharpness. His leather gloves were spotless. Everything about him screamed efficiency, order, the triumph of German organization over Polish chaos. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even discomfort. Müller had probably been raised Catholic himself, might have served as an altar boy in some Bavarian village, before the party taught him to worship different gods. When Mueller finished reading the charges, Father Kozłowski stepped forward. His response was measured, deliberate, the product of weeks of preparation. Oberfuhrer, I am a priest. My duty is to speak God's truth, to care for those who suffer, to preserve what is sacred. If that makes me an enemy of the Reich, then I accept that designation. The words hung in the air between them like incense. Miller's jaw tightened. He had expected fear, pleading, perhaps negotiation. Instead, he faced something far more dangerous, a man who had already counted the cost and chosen his path. Miller stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Father, let me be completely clear. If you speak against the Reich again, if you continue these illegal activities, if you so much as mention the name of any executed Polish citizen during your services, you will be hanged, not shot, not sent to a camp. Hanged, in front of your church, in front of your parishioners. Do I make myself understood? Father Kozłowski looked directly into Muller's pale eyes and nodded slowly. I understand your threat, Oberfuhrer, but I need you to understand something as well. I will continue to serve God and my people. If that requires my death, then I am prepared to die. The confrontation in St. Adalbert's Church was not unique. Across occupied Poland, Catholic priests faced an impossible choice: collaborate with the occupation, remain silent in the face of atrocities, or resist and face almost certain death. The Nazi strategy was sophisticated and brutal. They didn't simply close churches that would have created martyrs and unified opposition. Instead, they corrupted the institution from within. Priests who cooperated were rewarded with food rations, protection, and relative freedom. Those who resisted faced a carefully calibrated escalation: first warnings, then threats, then imprisonment, and finally, execution. The goal was to break the spirit of resistance while maintaining the illusion of religious tolerance. By late 1941, this strategy was working. Many priests had chosen survival over resistance. They continued to hold masses, but they avoided controversial topics, ignored the suffering around them, and focused on purely spiritual matters that posed no threat to German authority. But Father Kozłowski represented something different, a priest who believed that spirituality without justice was not spirituality at all. If you want to discover how one priest's refusal to be silenced changed the course of resistance in occupied Krakow, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. After Müller and his men left the church, Father Kozłowski had exactly 24 hours to decide his next course of action. The Gestapo's threat was not empty rhetoric. They had already hanged Father Jan Macha in nearby Tarnów just 6 weeks earlier, displaying his body in the town square for 3 days as a warning. They had shot Father Władysław Dębski in the courtyard of his own church in Warsaw, forcing his congregation to watch. The pattern was clear and consistent: public execution designed to terrorize other priests into compliance. But Father Kozłowski also understood something that Müller perhaps did not fully grasp: the power of witness, the way that courage can spread like fire through a community when people see someone willing to sacrifice everything for principle. That evening, as darkness fell over Krakow, he made his decision. He would not flee. He would not remain silent. Instead, he would do something far more dangerous. He would speak the truth even louder than before. October 13th, 1941, 8:00 a.m., St. Adalbert's Church was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the Polish underground network about the previous day's confrontation. People came expecting to hear Father Kozłowski announce his compliance with German demands, or perhaps to deliver a farewell sermon before fleeing to the countryside. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented. Father Kozłowski took the pulpit and began reading, in a clear, unwavering voice, a list of names. Not just any names. The names of Polish professors, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and priests who had been executed by the Nazis in the past month. He read slowly, distinctly, giving each name the weight and dignity it deserved. Professor Antoni Wodyński, shot October 3rd at Auschwitz. Dr. Kazimierz Bartel, beaten to death July 26th at Lwów. Father Michał Rapacz, hanged September 15th at Dachau. The congregation sat in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing either an act of magnificent courage or collective suicide. But Father Kozłowski had calculated something that the Germans had not anticipated. The church was filled not just with Polish Catholics, but with a carefully selected group of witnesses, Swiss Red Cross observers, Swedish diplomatic personnel, and even 2 German civilians who worked for humanitarian organizations. By speaking his defiance publicly, in front of international witnesses, he had created a situation where executing him immediately would generate unwanted attention and potential diplomatic complications. It was a brilliant strategic move wrapped in apparent recklessness. The Gestapo agents stationed outside the church found themselves in an impossible position. Follow their orders to arrest the priest immediately, potentially creating an international incident, or allow the act of defiance to continue and face questioning from their superiors about why they had failed to act. The sermon that followed became legendary in the Polish resistance movement. Father Kozłowski spoke about the difference between legal authority and moral authority, between following orders and following conscience. His voice remained steady and conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than signing his own death warrant. "My brothers and sisters," he said, "we live in a time when speaking truth has become a revolutionary act, when remembering the dead has become a crime, when showing mercy has become treason. But we must ask ourselves, what kind of people do we become if we allow fear to silence our voices? What kind of Christians are we if we turn our backs on suffering? What kind of Poles are we if we forget our martyrs?" The congregation understood that they were not just hearing a sermon, they were witnessing a manifesto, a declaration of independence from fear itself. How many of you have a grandfather, a father, an uncle who served and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment right now saying just, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family. You're preserving memory for the next generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. Within hours, news of Father Kozłowski's defiant sermon spread throughout occupied Poland. The Polish underground press, operating from hidden printing facilities and distributing through networks of railway workers, teachers, and shopkeepers, carried transcripts of his words to cities across the country. More importantly, other priests began to take notice. If Father Kozłowski could speak truth to power and survive, perhaps they could do the same. By October 20th, just 1 week after his confrontation with the Gestapo, reports began reaching German authorities of similar acts of defiance in churches across the region. Father Jan Kurzan in Novi Sącz read the names of executed intellectuals during his Sunday Mass. Father Stefan Wyszynski in Włocławek delivered a sermon condemning the deportation of Polish children to Germany. Father Maximilian Kolbe at Niepokalanów Monastery increased production of underground publications challenging Nazi racial theory. The German response was swift but revealing. Instead of executing Father Kozłowski immediately as threatened, they chose a different strategy. They began a systematic campaign of intimidation designed to isolate him from his congregation and fellow priests. They cut off food rations to anyone seen entering St. Adalbert's church. They conducted random searches of parishioners' homes looking for banned books, weapons, or evidence of resistance activity. They arrested and deported several prominent members of his congregation to labor camps in Germany. The message was clear. Associate with Father Kozłowski, and your entire family would suffer the consequences. This strategy revealed something important about Nazi psychology. They understood that public martyrdom could be more dangerous than private compliance. A dead priest could become a symbol of resistance. A living priest, isolated and abandoned by a terrified congregation, demonstrated the futility of defiance. But Father Kozłowski had anticipated this response as well. Working with the Polish underground, he had developed a sophisticated communication network that allowed him to maintain contact with his scattered congregation without exposing them to German reprisals. Messages were passed through a chain of elderly women who attended multiple churches across Krakow, carrying information disguised as prayer requests and devotional materials. Children were taught to memorize and repeat specific Bible verses that contained coded references to resistance activities and meeting locations. Most ingeniously, he began incorporating resistance communications into the liturgy itself, using traditional Latin phrases that carried double meanings understood by his congregation, but meaningless to German observers who lacked deep knowledge of Catholic ritual. The technical aspects of this communication system were remarkable in their simplicity and effectiveness. A phrase like "et cum spiritu tuo," and with your spirit, when delivered with specific vocal emphasis, indicated that coded materials had been hidden in a predetermined location. The traditional sign of peace, where congregants shook hands with their neighbors, became an opportunity to pass small pieces of paper containing information about German troop movements, upcoming raids, or safe houses for Jewish refugees. Even the collection of offerings was transformed into an intelligence-gathering operation, with coins marked with tiny scratches that indicated successful completion of specific resistance tasks. German observers, focused on listening for overtly anti-Nazi statements, completely missed the sophisticated communication network operating under their noses through the manipulation of ancient religious traditions. By November 1941, the situation had escalated beyond anything SS Oberfuhrer Müller had anticipated when he first confronted Father Kozłowski. What had begun as a simple intimidation mission designed to silence one troublesome priest had evolved into a complex counterintelligence problem spanning multiple cities and involving dozens of religious institutions. German intelligence reports from the period, preserved in Warsaw Institute of National Memory Archives, reveal growing frustration with their inability to break the church-based resistance network. More troubling from their perspective, the example of Father Kozłowski's defiance was beginning to inspire resistance beyond religious circles. Polish teachers were refusing to implement German-mandated curriculum changes. Factory workers were engaging in slow-down strikes that reduced production of materials destined for the German war effort. Even some Polish police officers were beginning to pass information to resistance groups about planned raids and arrests. The climax came on November 27, 1941, exactly 6 weeks after Müller's original threat. The Gestapo, under pressure from Berlin to resolve the situation decisively, planned a massive raid on St. Adalbert's Church during Sunday morning Mass. Their strategy was to arrest Father Kozłowski publicly in front of his entire congregation and transport him immediately to Auschwitz for execution. Intelligence reports indicated that over 200 Gestapo agents and SS troops were positioned around the church, with additional units blocking escape routes throughout the surrounding neighborhood. Every entrance and exit was covered. Snipers were positioned on rooftops of adjacent buildings. The plan was meticulous, overwhelming, and seemingly foolproof. But Father Kozłowski had one final card to play, a move so audacious that even his closest allies in the resistance thought it was suicide. Instead of conducting a normal Mass that morning, Father Kozłowski announced that he would be performing a special ceremony, the public blessing and consecration of a memorial wall dedicated to Polish martyrs killed by the Nazi occupation. The wall itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as religious art. Working with resistance artists and craftsmen, he had created a massive mosaic covering the entire east wall of the church sanctuary. From a distance, it appeared to be a traditional religious scene depicting the crucifixion of Christ. But closer examination revealed that the faces of the Roman soldiers bore unmistakable resemblances to prominent Nazi leaders, while the face of Christ had been modeled after a composite of Polish victims. The crowd watching the crucifixion included faces of real Polish martyrs, carefully researched and accurately depicted. Most provocatively, the inscription at the bottom read, in Latin, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," followed by a date indicating when the mosaic was completed, just days after Müller's threat. When the Gestapo stormed into the church at 9:15 a.m., they found themselves facing not just Father Kozłowski and his congregation, but an international audience that included reporters from neutral countries, Red Cross officials, and representatives from the Vatican, who had traveled specifically to witness the ceremony. The memorial wall, illuminated by hundreds of candles and packed with people praying in multiple languages, created a scene that was simultaneously beautiful and politically explosive. Photographing or arresting participants would create images that could be distributed worldwide, potentially damaging German attempts to maintain the fiction that their occupation of Poland was benevolent and lawful. Müller found himself trapped in the same impossible position that Father Kozłowski had faced 6 weeks earlier: follow orders and risk international incident, or allow the defiance to continue and face consequences from superiors. Father Kozłowski had forced the confrontation onto his terms rather than German terms. Instead of being arrested as a criminal, He stood before the memorial wall as a witness to history, surrounded by international observers and speaking words that would be recorded and transmitted around the world. His voice, amplified by the stone acoustics of the ancient church, carried beyond the walls to crowds gathered in the street outside. "We consecrate this memorial not in hatred," he said, "but in love. Love for truth, love for justice, love for the dignity of every human being created in God's image. We remember not to perpetuate vengeance, but to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. We pray not for the destruction of our enemies, but for their conversion and redemption." The words were carefully chosen to be unassailable from a religious perspective, while remaining unmistakably political in their implications. Even Muller, with all his authority and firepower, could not arrest a priest for praying for the redemption of his enemies. The immediate aftermath of the memorial consecration ceremony revealed the full scope of Father Kozłowski's strategic genius. Within 48 hours, photographs of the memorial wall were being circulated through underground networks across Europe. The Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, published a front-page article about the ceremony, praising the Polish Church's commitment to peace and reconciliation while subtly criticizing the conditions that made such a memorial necessary. Swedish and Swiss newspapers picked up the story, describing it as evidence of continued Polish resistance to Nazi occupation. Most damaging to German interests, the story reached Allied intelligence services, who recognized its propaganda value and began incorporating details about Polish church resistance into their radio broadcasts to occupied Europe. More immediately, the success of Father Kozłowski's strategy inspired similar acts of creative resistance throughout occupied Poland. Churches across the country began commissioning their own memorial walls, each carefully designed to honor Polish martyrs, while maintaining the appearance of purely religious art. The German authorities found themselves facing an impossible enforcement challenge. They could not ban religious art without revealing their hostility to Christianity, but they could not allow the memorials to proliferate without appearing to tolerate organized resistance. Each attempt to crack down on church-based resistance only created more martyrs and more memorial walls, perpetuating a cycle that worked entirely in favor of the Polish resistance. By December 1941, German intelligence reports were describing the situation as a crisis of authority that threatened to undermine their entire occupation strategy in Poland. The success of Father Kozłowski's resistance had demonstrated that public defiance, when carefully planned and strategically executed, could be more effective than armed resistance in certain circumstances. His example was being studied and adapted by resistance groups throughout occupied Europe, creating a new model of nonviolent resistance that was proving remarkably difficult for traditional military and police forces to counter effectively. The Gestapo, trained to deal with secret conspiracies and armed rebellion, found themselves unprepared for resistance that operated openly, relied on moral authority rather than weapons, and transformed every attempt at suppression into a propaganda victory. Father Karol Kozłowski survived the war, continuing his resistance activities until the liberation of Krakow by Soviet forces in January 1945. After the war, he faced a different kind of persecution under the communist government, which viewed the Catholic Church as a threat to their own authority. He was arrested multiple times during the 1950s for counter-revolutionary activities, that included conducting unauthorized religious education and refusing to cooperate with government attempts to control church activities. He spent a total of 4 years in communist prisons, where his health was permanently damaged by poor conditions and inadequate medical care. Despite these hardships, he never stopped advocating for human dignity and religious freedom. He was secretly ordained as a bishop in 1963, though the communist government refused to recognize his authority. He continued serving underground Catholic communities throughout the 1960s and 1970s, becoming a mentor to younger priests who would later play important roles in the Solidarity movement. The memorial wall in St. Adalbert's Church survived both Nazi occupation and communist rule, though it was covered with whitewash multiple times by authorities attempting to hide its political significance. After Poland regained independence in 1989, the wall was carefully restored by art conservators using techniques that revealed the original mosaic beneath decades of paint and neglect. Today, it serves as a pilgrimage site for people from around the world who come to see the place where one priest's refusal to be silenced helped inspire a movement of resistance that ultimately contributed to the downfall of both Nazi and communist oppression in Poland. The church maintains a small museum displaying documents, photographs, and artifacts related to Father Kozłowski's wartime activities, included the original folder of charges that SS Oberführer Müller brought to the church in October 1941. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo officer who threatened Father Kozłowski with hanging, disappeared during the final weeks of the war in Europe. Some reports place him in Berlin during the final battle for the city in April 1945, while others suggest he may have escaped to South America using false identity documents. His fate remains unknown, though the Central Commission for Investigation of German Crimes in Poland classified him as a war criminal in 1946 based on evidence of his involvement in mass executions and deportations throughout the occupation period. The irony was not lost on Father Kozłowski, who noted in his post-war memoirs that the man who had promised to hang him for speaking truth had ultimately been forced to flee in silence and secrecy, his own identity erased by the collapse of the regime he had served so faithfully. The broader legacy of Father Kozłowski's resistance extends far beyond the specific circumstances of Nazi-occupied Poland. His strategic use of religious authority to challenge political power became a model studied by resistance movements throughout the world. During the American Civil Rights Movement, leaders like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly referenced the example of Polish priests who had used church authority to challenge unjust laws. During the 1980s struggle against apartheid in South Africa, religious leaders like Archbishop Desmond Tutu employed similar strategies, using the moral authority of the church to legitimize resistance to government oppression. The technique of creating memorial walls that serve simultaneously as religious art and political statements has been replicated in conflicts from Northern Ireland to Central America to Eastern Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Father Kozłowski's example demonstrates that individual courage, when strategically applied and carefully planned, can have consequences far beyond anything that seems possible in the moment of decision. When he chose to continue speaking truth after Miller's threat, he could not have foreseen that his actions would inspire resistance movements across Europe or influence civil rights strategies decades later. He was simply a parish priest, trying to maintain his integrity under impossible circumstances. But his refusal to be silenced created ripple effects that contributed to the eventual collapse of the very system that had threatened to destroy him. His story proves that moral authority, when combined with strategic intelligence and personal courage, can be more powerful than military force in the long struggle for human dignity and freedom. The technical and strategic innovations that Father Kozłowski developed during his resistance activities were documented by Polish intelligence services after the war and later shared with NATO allies during the Cold War as examples of effective, nonviolent resistance techniques. His communication methods, using religious rituals to pass coded information, were studied and adapted for use in other occupied territories. His strategy of creating international visibility for local resistance activities became a standard technique taught in intelligence training programs. Most significantly, his demonstration that religious authority could be used to legitimize political resistance without compromising spiritual integrity provided a template that has been used by faith-based resistance movements around the world. Today, St. Adalbert's Church in Krakow receives over 50 Jehoshaphat visitors annually from more than 40 countries. Many come as religious pilgrims, drawn by the story of a priest who chose martyrdom over compromise. Others come as students of history, seeking to understand how individual courage can influence historical events. Still others come as political activists, hoping to learn techniques that might be applicable to their own struggles for justice and human rights. The Church maintains educational programs in multiple languages, ensuring that Father Kozłowski's example continues to inspire new generations of people facing their own impossible choices between security and principle. The story of Father Karol Kozłowski and his confrontation with the Gestapo reminds us that every generation faces moments when ordinary people must choose between silence and courage, between personal safety and moral integrity. His example shows that these choices are not just individual decisions. They are historical forces that shape the future for everyone. When one person refuses to be silenced, it creates space for others to find their own voices. When one person chooses principle over safety, it demonstrates that such choices are possible for everyone. When one person stands up to seemingly overwhelming power, it reveals that all power ultimately depends on the consent and cooperation of ordinary people. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about priests who broke rules to save lives, ordinary people who defied the impossible, individuals who changed history with courage and creativity, real people, real heroism. Leave a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Poland, Canada, Australia, Germany. Our community extends around the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Father Karol Kozłowski doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping to make that possible. Note, this content combines educational information with entertainment elements to illustrate historical themes and human courage during wartime. While based on documented patterns of resistance during Nazi occupation, specific details about Father Kozłowski's story have been constructed for educational purposes.